I'm Julie Sikora, and I've been a knitter for over 50 years. After I was ordained to the priesthood, a good friend of mine gave me a book, Beginning to Pray by Anthony Bloom. She knew I was relatively new to prayer and that I was struggling to maintain a regular prayer practice. I was delighted to find a story in the book about a woman who complains to the author that she feels an absence of silence every time she tries to pray. The author invites her to sit in silence and knit before the face of God. So the woman takes up her knitting, and soon she becomes aware of a presence in the silence. After I read this story, I wondered, could knitting be a way into a contemplative prayer practice? Knitting for me has always been about love and connection. Every time I sit down with needles and yarn, I think of my grandmother. I would snuggle up against her on the couch, and she would put her hands over mine and show me how to knit each stitch. Every time she picked up my drop stitches, she'd hand it back to me and she'd say, "Don't worry, results will come over time." Of course, she was right. Over time, I learned how to knit, and the stitches collected on my needles just like they did on hers. At first, I knit for myself, and then I started to knit for others. I tried to put the love that I felt from my grandmother into each hat and mittens and scarf. I thought about women who had knit socks for their loved ones during the war. How they must have prayed for safety and comfort. I'm sure they were intentionally putting love into each stitch for the recipient. The idea of knitting prayers into shawls started in the late 90s. Prayer shawls were a way to make intercessory prayers visible. I started knitting prayer shawls, and sometimes I would knit for someone I knew who was suffering. Other times I would knit for people I didn't even know. I would always pray for healing for that person every time I knit a stitch. These prayers made me long for a deeper relationship with God. I realized after reading the story about the knitting woman in Anthony Bloom's book that maybe starting a contemplative prayer practice with knitting could be a way to spend time in the presence of God. So I decided I would sit and knit in silence. Now, I've tried to have contemplative prayer practices in the past, but this time I wanted to figure out a way I could stick with it once my initial enthusiasm waned. I decided I would be intentional about how to conduct this new spiritual discipline. So I began to research both knitting and prayer. I discovered lots of stories about knitting and love and connection. I found advice on establishing and sustaining a habit, which I used to develop a template for knitters who want to deepen their relationship with God and use knitting as the doorway. This is contemplative knitting.